My name is Mike Hess. I am the COPD Foundation's Senior Director of Public Outreach and Education. It's a pleasure to be here today with everybody, especially my good friend, John Linnell. John?
I'm John Linnell. I'm a COPD patient. I live in Wisconsin and I'm a state captain for Wisconsin for the COPD Foundation.
All right. Now, last thing we need to do. There we go. We're trying a little bit of new technology here so that we can see ourselves, we can see the slideshow, and we can have some good interaction here. So we are here, of course, to discuss a variety of the common myths involved with oxygen therapy. And so we're going to have some good conversation with that. And if I can hit the right buttons here. Easier said than done, apparently. We're going to move this over here. They told me you shouldn't do it live. You shouldn't do it live. There we go. FYI, John's mic is about 5 times louder. Well, we can fix that. All right. Always good to get some of the audio bugs worked out quickly, hopefully. All right, and again, we'll take all this out in post. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the more common myths involved in oxygen. Boy, this is just being really stubborn with me today. All right. So again, John Linnell, Mike Hess, we are here, and we are going to talk about, we're going to jump right into it here. John, one of the most common myths that I hear is that oxygen tubing needs to be less than 50 feet or 15 meters long. Have you ever heard anything like that before?
I've heard that people that use a portable concentrator say it can't be longer than 7 feet. And for home concentrators, I've heard everything from 25 to 100 or more. I mean, I'm interested to see what we have found as we decide if we need to bust this myth or not. But I've in my research found that it's okay if you have at least a stationary concentrator. You can run up to at least 100 feet without loss of delivery. So that's what I know, only from what I as a patient have learned.
All right. So maybe some of you have discovered this myth as well. And we did a little research on it, and we found a couple of interesting things. We first found in this magazine, this journal, I should say, this peer-reviewed journal called Chronic Respiratory Disease. What one group did, this was back in 2005, as you can see on the screen there. They took 25-foot lengths of tubing, and they attached them one at a time to a variety of setups. They had the traditional compressed gas cylinder, or the tanks that they're sometimes called. They had an oxygen concentrator, a stationary oxygen concentrator, and they had a liquid oxygen reservoir. That's a little bit hard to come by these days, but in 2005 they did that because they wanted to see if there was any differences between the different devices, the outputs, and all that sort of thing. And they tested at each 25-foot length, and they found that there wasn't any difference in flow, there wasn't any difference in oxygen quality, all the way out to 200 feet. So not only was it better than 50 feet, but all the way out to 200 feet. Now, of course, in medicine, we do like to verify a lot of these findings. And so in 2015, there was another study that was done in a journal called Respiratory Care, which is the journal of my professional organization, the American Association for Respiratory Care. This group went about it slightly differently, and they looked at two different concentrator setups, two different concentrator brands, as well as the compressed gas cylinder. They found at 100 feet, the flow is actually slightly higher than was set on the device. And the FiO2, the purity or the concentration of the oxygen was actually slightly lower, but both of those were less than 1% different. There was very little difference in that after that 100 feet. So clinically speaking, probably not any kind of impact. And so certainly up to 100 feet and arguably up to about 200 feet definitely seems to be safe to use. Now, again, there are, of course, a lot of, as Kevin points out here, some basic physics stuff, of course. But of course, along with the basic physics stuff, we do have some caveats out there where we can't control for every setup. There are devices that may malfunction or things like that. So use caution. But generally speaking, John, what would you say about this myth?
I think, that makes perfect sense to me. I would worry more about those that are on pulse and how far they can go getting a pulse delivery. Hopefully no one on a portable concentrator with pulse is going to be using a 50-foot or 100-foot cord, but there needs to be a limit on that as well.
Yeah, it's a great point because we do see in some parts of the country there are people who are getting these portable concentrators that don't necessarily have that continuous output. And we're going to dive into that a little bit later on in the show. They don't necessarily have that continuous output, and they have this pulse delivery instead. And so then we start getting into the idea of, is that pulse, does that sustain through the 100 feet and so on and so forth. So for stationary devices or devices that provide continuous flow is probably a better way to put that. We can probably say this myth is pretty well busted. I would say, at least, John.
I would just add to that, though, that if you are going to use a tubing of that length, use swivels between the connectors, which will really help prevent the kinks, and you won't be tripping over it as much, and it's just much easier to use as you go about your day.
That's a great point. All right, so moving on to our next myth. Let's see if this one perhaps is a surprising one to bring up. But I'll be interested to get John's thoughts on this. And then I'll mention why exactly we may look at this as something of a myth. So we're looking at the statement that oxygen does not need to be humidified. John, what would you say to that?
In all the social media groups I'm on, I hear complaints about dry nasal passages. And I don't know, and maybe they don't know, if it's because of the oxygen itself, which is a dry gas, or if it's just the lack of humidity in the air. But most everyone says, oh, you need to humidify your oxygen. You need to put a water bottle on yours. I can only speak for myself. I've never used one. I've never needed one. I use 2 liters while I'm sleeping, and I use up to 4 liters during the day if I'm actively, like, on the treadmill or actively exercising. And just, to me, it's not been a bother. I know that something like air, AYR, air gel, is recommended as a non-petroleum product lubricant for the nares. If you do use oxygen, if you do use humidified oxygen, from what I understand, you really should use nothing but distilled water. And that bottle also needs to be emptied and sterilized, at least with vinegar, daily. So there's a lot of upkeep to it. So it's a lot more complicated than just taking a bottle. This is my coffee cup, but a bottle and putting the cap on it and feeding your tube into it. And maybe next week, if it needs more water, that won't work.
Well, yeah, John, you bring up some great points, and I want to point out that we are talking about specifically these kinds of humidifiers. John, you mentioned one that's like a cup with a lid on it, or you used your cup, I should say. There are some like that. There are some that come pre-filled, mostly seen in the hospital setting, but occasionally we'll see these out in the wild, so to speak. So you are not a big humidifier fan, and you bring up some good points about why there might be some issues involved. And looking at it from the respiratory therapy perspective, throughout my career, we as a profession have tended to lean more toward not humidifying. And as a young pup RT, that always kind of surprised me because I thought, this is a very dry gas. When folks are using concentrators and things like that, it may not be terribly as dry because we're using the surrounding air and kind of filtering out some of the nitrogen out of it, compressing it down, and that's what the concentration aspect of a concentrator is. But particularly if you use gas or gas air that's straight from a gas cylinder, it's very, very, very dry by law, by design. It has to be virtually pure, and that means no water molecules in there, and that means no humidity. So to me, when you have a very dry gas and you're blowing it, because we know blowing on stuff tends to cause evaporation or what have you, and that seems like that would really dry things out a lot to me. And again, in patient care, I did have a lot of folks that would complain about it. But then the RT perspective is the infection control risk or the infection control concerns, are they worth the humidification? So that's really what we want to look at. And Tony brings in a good point too. It says the relative humidity here in Las Vegas averages about 10%, which makes a humidifier necessary most of the time. So let's take a look at whether it is clinically necessary. They've done a few different studies on this. One of the biggest ones, arguably, was published in 2016. And I say biggest because this is probably one of the most well-known respiratory journals that there is. It's called CHEST. It's from the American College of Chest Physicians. And what this group found, was, we'll say speaking of humidity, we'll say the very dry version first. In subjects receiving chronic nasal low flow oxygen, cold bubble humidification does not adequately humidify inspired oxygen to prevent deterioration of mucociliary clearance. So we'll stop right there and we'll unpack some of this stuff. A nasal low flow oxygenation. So we've got oxygen going in through the nose at relatively low flows from 1 to 6 liters. We're talking about cold bubble humidification. We don't have a heater on it or anything like that. We're not talking about room humidification. This is specifically the oxygen that's going into your nose without any kind of heat or anything like that. That does not humidify inspired oxygen enough to prevent breakdown in being able to clear mucus, cough things up, and that sort of thing. A lot of times when mucus gets dry, it can get very hard to cough up. So we're not seeing that bubble humidification has much of an impact on that. Similarly, going along with that, mucus hydration, the next thing here, doesn't really have an impact on that. And finally, pulmonary function. These are those numbers that everybody clinical likes to throw around, like FEV1 or FEC. All those kinds of numbers doesn't really impact those very much. And their takeaway from this is the unheated bubble humidifier doesn't do any better than no humidification at all. So that's probably a bit of a surprise to Tony, but we'll get to some of the reasons why, and why that might be a surprise is in a few minutes. So we're getting a couple things here. Louise puts in, if you use a water bottle, you need to change your tubing cannulas more often. Absolutely. Relative humidity is an issue. Noah Greenspan checking in. The addition of a humidifier is minuscule to comparison to the room air where most of the humidity is determined. Drying in the nasal passages comes from the direct row by. Excellent points. And Stephanie is mentioning that we don't have any audio. So if anybody else is having some audio problems, please let us know. We're trying to make sure that we're staying live here, and most people seem to be able to hear us. Not sure. But we're going to power on here, and we're going to look at our next study, which came from a journal called the Journal of Advanced Nursing. And they found that the routine humidification of oxygen in low-flow oxygen, again, we're looking at that 1 to 6 liters here, is not justifiable. Non-humidified oxygen tends to be more beneficial. John, what would you say to the statement that dry oxygen tends to be even more beneficial than humidified oxygen?
I'm having trouble with the audio, so you're going to have to repeat the question.
Okay, so we're having some intermittent audio problems. How would you respond to the statement, non-humidified oxygen tends to be more beneficial than adding the humidifier?
Well, I think either way you're getting the oxygen. If the humidified oxygen makes your nasal passages feel better, I don't think it's going to hurt any, and it makes you more comfortable. Like Tony in Las Vegas may feel better using humidified oxygen. The studies show that it didn't help deliver more oxygen, but it didn't really hurt. But you still need to be very careful to keep your delivery system sterile and clean.
Absolutely. Now, I paused there for a minute because I really want to highlight the second sentence of their conclusion here. Considering the quality of most included studies is poor, we need to have rigorously designed, large-scale, randomized controlled trials to identify the role, if there is one, for non-humidified oxygen therapy. So, do we know? Not particularly, but we have some thoughts on it. And finally, the Annals of Intensive Care tells us that overall, oxygen therapy-related discomfort was low. Dry oxygen could not be demonstrated as non-inferior, which is a kind of a fancy way of saying putting the humidification on there wasn't any better after 6 to 8 hours and after 24 hours. So they looked at 4 liters a minute or less. So again, we're not really looking at adding a tremendous amount of benefit. Kevin asked the question, would the moisture added make mucus more sticky so that it acts more like a glue? What I would say from the clinical side of things is usually adding moisture would actually make it a little runnier, less like glue. However, I think we can see here that adding humidity or adding moisture through humidity probably isn't the way to go. So John, might you have any suggestions about how we might be able to thin out some mucus if humidity isn't going to be working for us?
I think if you're using it for mucus to expel mucus, you would use a PEP device, positive expiratory pressure, such as an aerobica or an acapella, or recently there's another one that's been mentioned on Facebook quite a bit lately. I can't remember the name of it. I personally have an acapella and an aerobica, and for me the aerobica works better, but they're both fine devices.
Do you think that there's a role for making sure that you're taking in enough water? You flashed your cup a little bit earlier. Are you making sure you're staying hydrated all right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to drink water for many reasons. But yes, that helps. And just then there's the old myth about you can't drink milk because it creates mucus, which it does not. It could cause the mucus you already have to perhaps be a little thicker, but that's only if you don't drink the water that you should be drinking. But that's a different topic for a different day. But you open the doors. So I live in Wisconsin. We're the dairy state. I had to throw that in.
Absolutely. So we're going to call this one confirmed. Actually, you do not need to humidify your oxygen. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't, but you do have to be cautious, as has been mentioned a couple of times. If you're going to humidify, if it's subjectively more comfortable for you and you want to humidify your oxygen, just make sure that you're taking care of yourself from an infection control standpoint, making sure everything is changed regularly, cleaned regularly, and you're keeping yourself safe. Want to also add in a couple of things here. Kula, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, says that they use a humidifier and had to add a reservoir to prevent water from entering the tubing. The reservoir decreased my airflow by about a liter, and it took several weeks to determine the loss of flow. So if you are, that's another thing to be concerned about if you're using humidity. Make sure that you don't have any leaks. Make sure that you're not adding extra resistance. Make sure you're not having any of those any additional factors that might make your stuff a little bit more complicated. And then Tony mentions that while he hasn't actually been on supplemental oxygen, his wife is, and currently not using the humidifier. However, when she goes into the hospital, they always humidify it. So different places have different practices. I worked at a place that leaned a little bit heavy on humidification use, and one that tried to shy away from it only by request and that sort of thing. So each place is going to be a little bit different, and it's probably going to have a little bit of a factor where you are in the country and everything, and how many journals they've read, I guess. We are getting some really good questions in. I want to point out that we are going to have the open question and answer toward the end of the show here, after we get through the some of the links or some of the myths that we already have here. I do want to go back a little bit. There were two points that Kevin pointed out, that when we were talking about the long tubing, be careful if you are adding tubing to that. Watch out for any tripping hazards, making sure you're keeping yourself in that regard. And then Joe says it's actually kind of cool that we were able to bust that myth, because they can add 50 feet or so and get to the mailbox and back a little bit, because it's a pain to switch back and forth from their portable concentrator. So we're doing some good work here, John. But again, we're making sure people are keeping safe. And Mark Mangus checking in here. In RT school, we measured oxygen flow through bubbled humidifiers with a hygrometer, which is a scientific device to measure humidity. We measured absolute humidity, which is the total amount of moisture in the air, as compared to relative humidity, which is the amount of moisture that's in the air compared to the maximum that it can hold, and also temperature. What they found was that even at 2 liters a minute, the temperature of the outgoing gas decreased. Absolute humidity did not increase beyond a few percentage points from baseline. As flows went up, temperature dropped even more, and absolute humidity did not increase more than a few percentage points. Cold air doesn't hold as much as warmer air does, of course. When all the added humidity was added against the tidal volume, or the amount of air you normally inhale, the benefit was negligible, essentially. So we can now add a fourth scientific review to our busting here. So let's take a look at what's next. This is a good one here. This is one that I like to talk about. Oxygen cannulas and tubing should be changed every 2 weeks. John, what do you say about this one?
I tend to, I've seen so many ideas, studies, opinions, et cetera, and we have to make sure we understand cannula and lengthy tubing are different. You're not going to go and change your 50-foot hose every 2 weeks. I think, and again, it, I think that standard that they tell patients is to change your cannula every 2 weeks and your tubing every 2 to 3 months. But I don't, it depends what I do, because I want to also live my life, but I want to be safe. So I'm not going to write down on my calendar and make sure that I have a plethora of supplies and I do it by the calendar. I can tell because of the type of cannula I use, it starts getting hard. And when it gets hard, it gets uncomfortable. And that is about every, 10 to 18 days, in there. And that may vary with maybe the humidity. And I change it when I feel that I'm not comfortable anymore. But
Okay.
it's never more than 3 weeks. But
So
if I'm sick or coming off an exacerbation, then you change it immediately because you don't you want to get the nasties out of there. I'm finally feeling better. I want to keep feeling better.
absolutely. So that's the lived experience. As a clinical on the clinical side, as somebody who doesn't use oxygen myself, I go to, and in researching these myths, I wanted to go to our authorities, so to speak, our expert guidance and all that sort of thing. And for a lot of this stuff, this is a site called PubMed, pubmed.gov. This is where we have a lot of peer-reviewed journals. The Journal of the COPD Foundation is listed in PubMed. This is really one of the most respected repositories, not only most respected, but most comprehensive, most complete warehouses of clinical information that there is. So I assume that there would be just a huge amount of information about how often we should be changing in tubing for infection control and all that stuff. And what I found was pretty much nothing. It's not the kind of thing that has been researched very well, apparently. So we don't entirely know from a clinical perspective. So another resource I went to is our own social media network, COPD360 Social, which is a dedicated to COPD social network, about 51,000 people, with COPD, their caregivers, clinicians, all these groups. And so I thought, well, surely somebody here would likely know the answer. And what I found here, I did find one article that, because this is a question that does get asked fairly routinely. And the answer here was, according to Medicare guidelines, we're supposed to be furnished, we as in the oxygen using community, supposed to be furnished with sufficient cannulas to replace every 2 weeks and tubing to replace every 3 months. So very much in line with what John was saying at the top here. And then, of course, also after recovering from infections as well. So I wanted to take a look at those Medicare guidelines. And unfortunately, it seems that things have somewhat changed. Because what I found this statement in some draft guidelines from 2005. But since then, Medicare guidelines have gone through some updating. And now they're essentially silent on how long you should change your tubing, because about the only thing in these guidelines is talking about, they're actually referring to the AARC clinical practice guidelines, the respiratory therapy guidelines that were last updated in 2007. So it's a little bit more recent. But even then, these say, under normal circumstances, low flow oxygen systems without humidifiers, those pesky humidifiers, do not represent a clinically important risk of infection, and so therefore do not need to be routinely replaced. But they also put their disclaimer on there that there are no definitive studies regarding the frequency of tube changes at home or in long-term care facilities. So, again, we're really kind of scrambling around in the dark here because we don't entirely know. So since we don't have really strong evidence guidelines. What are some of our best practices? When we're talking about clinical research, there are levels of evidence. There are randomized controlled trials, there are less randomized trials, there are some retrospective reviews, there's all these different things. And we kind of now go to expert opinion, basically. And I found some expert opinion from a pulmonary fibrosis website, actually, that was giving some guidance as to how often we should be changing tubing, or at least some things to consider. First off is, how often are you using your cannula or your tubing? Now, John, I don't mean to call you out or anything like that right now, but I noticed that you're not using your oxygen right this second. So can you tell us a little bit more about what your usual oxygen routine is?
As far as just simply using it,
Yeah, like we know that there are different circumstances where somebody might use oxygen. So
okay, no,
what are
I use
circumstances where you use oxygen?
I use oxygen nocturnally. I sleep with 2 liters. My stationary concentrator is upstairs. I have a portable concentrator that I have it always near me. I don't use oxygen when I'm sitting, but when I'm ambulatory, if I'm doing anything more than simply walking to the kitchen to get some coffee, then I'll put it on. And I got a nice backpack that because that way my arms are free. I can go shopping, I can go walking the dog, and it's not going to fall off. And as I mentioned earlier, well, the prescription says up to 4 liters per minute, but I don't need 4 liters just walking around. And if I did, and I know we'll get into this later, but the portable, it ain't going to cut it. So it does what it needs to do. And
So,
I change the cannula, as we talked earlier, when it gets nasty. And it's always in plenty of time. And I would tell everyone too, especially if you're on Medicare or if you have insurance, your DME, your supplier, is going to provide it. It's part of the package. So I want to take care of the earth and not waste plastic either. So don't change it every 2 or 3 days. But don't be afraid to change it. It needs changing. You're not saving yourself any money. You're paying for it anyway through your insurance premiums.
and as some folks have guessed in the comments here, it really does depend on a lot of these factors. So some people may be using their cannulas 24 hours a day. So they may want to change a little bit more frequently than somebody who is using it with activity or only with sleep, or like John with activity and sleep. We also have to keep in mind whether you're using the humidifier. It's probably a good thing we started with that one, because this one pops up a lot. So if you're using a humidifier, you're probably going to want to change your tubing out a little bit more, or you may end up having to change it out a little bit more because it's just a little bit more fertile ground to grow little bugs and stuff like that in there. Have you been sick? That was mentioned. John brought that up, and I think it's been in the comments a time or two. You don't want to get sick after you're feeling better, so you don't want to use your contaminated tubing. How
And
does
I
it
see
look?
Barbara just mentioned that too. She said it depends if I'm sick. I change it more often, and I had mentioned that earlier also. So I'm glad we're on the same page there, because if you're getting over an illness, change your cannula. Let's get rid of it.
Yep. And I see Kevin had also mentioned, as you mentioned, sometimes your tubing gets a little stiff. So if it's looking a little bit weird, if it's feeling a little bit weird, it's probably time to change that out a little bit. When Bob mentions when things get dry and stiff, the diameter seems to have gotten a little bit smaller. Nothing that he's measured, which is probably awfully tough to measure unless you get some calipers or something like that. Kevin said there's a lot of variables. Yes, absolutely. We're seeing that right now. Bob asked what the pandemic guidelines for changing it are. I haven't seen any other guidance of that. Of course, if you've gotten sick with the pandemic illness, whose name we shall shall go unnamed, I would change that out because, again, you don't want to get any kind of contamination going. We've got some great ideas in the comments about types of tubing, soft tubing, all that kind of stuff. We've seen a 3 to 6 month in there. So again, we're seeing a lot of different answers. When you do change your tubing, also remember, just again from an infection control standpoint, make sure that you're changing out your filters and things like that as well. If you're using a concentrator, change out some of those filters, or at least take a look at them. Again, these are things that are part of the oxygen benefit, so that your durable medical equipment provider should be supplying for you along with your cannulas and tubing. One way that does seem to be kind of going along the lines of changing it when you get sick or trying to avoid getting sick. Let's make sure that everybody's still washing your hands before you touch the cannula or anything like that, because here's a nice graphic from CDC that talks about key times to washing your hands, and one of those is before touching your face. So if you're taking your cannula on or off, make sure you're just washing your hands real quick first, doing that. Well, not real quick. I shouldn't say real quick. That 20-second hand wash to get everything all scrubbed up pretty good there. Because we are still dealing with that pandemic, and we don't want to attempt fade at all or anything like that. A couple other things in here. Barbara also mentions that changes it more often when she's sick. Oh, John mentioned that. And Jeannie, hi Jeannie, mentions that her DME has horrible cannulas. I like to buy my own because I like the softer brand, so she keeps a bunch on hand and changes them every 2 to 3 weeks. So again, this is going to be one of those personal preference kind of things. But the idea that it absolutely positively has to be changed every 2 weeks, or should be changed every 2 weeks, we're going to call that one busted with an asterisk, if you'll allow us that one. Because sometimes it's going to be more, sometimes it's going to be less. And one thing that I did find in the oxygen benefit guidelines, as John mentioned, your supplier should supply you with what you need. That's part of the deal. That shouldn't necessarily be on you. So next, I think this is kind of our grand finale as far as our myths go, and one that comes up quite a bit in a lot of our different circles. And this is, as you can see, my portable concentrator setting of 2 is the same as my home concentrator setting of 2 liters per minute. John, have you ever heard this one before?
To do what?
My portable concentrator setting of 2 is the same as my home concentrator setting of 2 liters a minute.
No, that's probably the most common fallacy with people that want or think they need a portable concentrator. The settings are random. They're what the manufacturer deems to be the equivalent of. But any lightweight portable concentrator is going to generate at most, even at a setting of, I think one of them goes to 6. That one, I think, puts out 1.35 liters per minute, but it does it. And I know you're going to get into this, but it gives it to you in bursts, so it's not constantly putting it out when you're not inhaling. But see, that's false for 2 reasons. Because even when you're not inhaling, if you have a continuous flow, it's still filling your nasal passages with oxygen. So when you do inhale, you're getting all of that buildup as well as what's coming out of the cannula with the nice ear pads.
So exactly, let's take a look at exactly how these things work. Our stationary concentrators, or actually I was planning on changing that and talking about the idea of continuous flow, because a lot of our gas cylinders also can provide continuous flow. You can kind of see it's always on, it's always moving across there. As John was saying, even when you're not inhaling, it can be filling up your sinus cavities and all that sort of thing. giving you a little bit of an extra reserve. Portable concentrators and certain regulators that are on the portable gas cylinders will only give you oxygen when you start to inhale. There's a little pressure sensor in there, or I think it's a pressure sensor. If Mark's still watching, he'll probably correct me if I'm wrong here. But it will detect you start to inhale and give you a burst. As you can see, there it
A
is.
bolus.
That animation goes there. Gives you that little burst of oxygen. Now that seems maybe a little bit counterintuitive at first, because it's like, well, shouldn't I always be getting oxygen? But it's not that bad for a couple of reasons. First off, and this is admittedly kind of a complicated graph, but this is what we call a flow time curve. And what we see, that very first second of inhale there, or actually that 0.2 of a second of inhale, you get a whole chunk of air, inhaled gas, in that first 0.2 of a second. And so that is when the concentrator, the pulse dose concentrator, or the pulse dose delivery, is giving you that burst, the most effective time to get you the biggest bang for your buck. Because the idea is the gas that's delivered during exhalation and all that isn't really doing you a whole lot of good. And so in order to save battery life, or to save time in the cylinder, conserve some of the gas a little bit, it's only going to give you exactly what you need. But it can be a little bit tricky to figure that out. And when we start getting into the concentrators, it's important to recognize that not every breath is necessarily created equal. This is a chart that came out of the American Association for Respiratory Care Guide to Portable Oxygen Concentrators. And I blocked out the different brand names and model numbers and all that stuff, because we don't want to imply that one is worse or one is better or anything like that, because they're all just different. What I really want to draw your attention to is looking up and down the columns there. So for example, bit toward the center of the page there's the column that's 3. It's a 3 setting. We see some concentrators will give you a certain amount over the course of a minute. They may deliver, or they may hold off on delivering some breaths, but they're going to give you about half a liter per minute. Some of these other ones will give you, for example, 48 milliliters per breath. Another device gives you 42 milliliters per breath, or 37.1 milliliters per breath. Now again, this is all the same setting. This is the same number. And it's really easy to get confused to say, well, if I'm doing 3 liters a minute, I should set it at 3. And that's not necessarily the case, because not all breaths are the same. You can't really compare one across companies or anything like that, because everybody's got their own little flavor on it. And like John said, kind of what they feel the equivalent is, what their breath strategy is. And then I don't want to get too far into this because it's math and I want people to keep watching. But even if we go through some of the math here, you take about 16 breaths a minute. So you've got one concentrator that gives you 32 milliliters of oxygen per breath. You do the math on that, that ends up being 512 milliliters, which is the equivalent to half a liter per minute. So again, it's a little bit apples to oranges, because it's giving it to you at supposedly a more precise time, or a more effective time. But really the big takeaway here is we've got brand A that does exactly what we did on that slide. And then we've got brand B at the same setting that actually delivers lower oxygen per breath and gives you, over the course of a minute, a fairly substantially lower amount of oxygen, at least in my opinion. So again, if you start on one concentrator and something goes wrong with it and you have to trade it in and you get a different one, you may not necessarily be getting the same kind of dose delivery. So John, what would we offer for some advice for somebody who is new to a portable oxygen system and is experimenting with some of the portable or the pulse dosing here?
I think portable systems are wonderful for some people. I tend to, it's been different since COVID, but I fly, and you cannot take tank or liquid on an aircraft in the United States. So if you do need oxygen while traveling, well, then you need a portable because it's certainly better than nothing, but you still don't want to put yourself in danger. I'm not poo pooing it. I'm just saying that people need to understand the differences that we've gone through. And so if I could give them one piece of advice, try before you buy. Make sure that it works for you. And preferably with a respiratory therapist or someone that can say, this is working for you at this level of exertion. If it's working for you sitting down, that's meaningless if you need to walk through an airport or if you need to go on a hike with your significant other, whatever you need it for. So try before you buy. That's all I'm saying. And if you pay for it out of pocket and buy it outright, just remember repair costs can be very, very costly. And what are you going to do while it's in the shop?
So you're backed up in the crowd here by Caroline, who's another one of our patient advisors for our Oxygen 360 team, as a matter of fact, who says, need to experiment on what setting keeps you saturated, especially with that device. It kind of goes into the try before you buy thing and making sure that even if you can't try it before you acquire it, making sure you play around with it a little bit to make sure that you are getting the dose that you need to keep yourself tolerating activity and everything else. Jimmy Slover, and nice to see you, Jimmy, also mentions that's the key. Make sure it
Good,
works
Jimmy.
for you. And Ricky chimes in with the Ryan report at Pulmonary Paper defines exactly what each portable oxygen concentrator delivers. And I'm glad you brought that up, Ricky, because I don't think I'm spoiling too much, but we are going to have a special guest in November, the next time we do one of these Facebook Lives. A gentleman by the name of Ryan Deesum, the author of the Ryan Report, and expert probably isn't a strong enough word, but if there's anybody out there who knows more about portable oxygen concentrators than Ryan, I haven't come across him yet. But so he will be joining us for our special COPD Awareness Month episode of this Facebook Live show. So a couple other things before we move on. So Mark, who is right up there with Ryan with his knowledge, talks about each company bases its liter flow equivalency upon an assumed tidal volume, which is, again, how much when you're breathing normally. That's a tidal volume because it's like the tides. A specific inspiratory time, which is kind of weird because everybody's slightly different with that, and how much it puts with each pulse. After that, those that place the gas bolus during, say, the last 2/3 of each breath will deliver even less and still call it liters per minute. So again, each company has kind of their own technique to figuring out exactly how they're going to deliver that breath. And that's why we see some variation like what we've got going on the screen right now. And Mark says, titrate to saturate and titrate as you migrate.
Let me guess. That's a quote from Dr. Tom Petty. I'm guessing.
That would not surprise me at all. Jean mentions that she uses her oximeter to ensure that her saturation is where it needs to be. And Noah chimes in with, make sure the company is willing to take it back or exchange it with zero restocking fee. And as always,
absolutely
get that in writing. So excellent advice all around there. Nobody adheres to the specs companies assume, as Mark says. So yes, absolutely. And we're going to go ahead. I think it's very safe to call this one completely busted. No caveats, no asterisks, no disclaimers, anything like that.
I think it's great that both Mark and Noah Greenspan both chimed in. It's a regular cavalcade of stars.
Yeah, it's fantastic to get expert advice in the comments too. I really appreciate everybody joining in today.
Absolutely.
It's great to have the clinical advice. It's great to have the lived experience. As I've said many times, I can theoretically understand what a lot of this stuff is about, but I don't have the lung issue. I don't have the breathing problems. I don't live it. So I can't tell you I know how you feel or anything like that. And so it's really great to be able to have advice from the crowd. And that's a great transition for getting us into the closer of our talk here. Again, brought to you by the Oxygen360 project. We're trying to revolutionize oxygen therapy. It's something that you can actually be a part of as well. Everybody in the audience today, we need your help. We need your stories of living well with oxygen. We need your tips about how to tell when you need to change your cannulas and when issues are popping up. How do you figure out what portable device is right for you? We need to better understand the challenges that everybody has with their oxygen equipment, with their oxygen suppliers, with all of these things so that we can more effectively advocate for everybody. We need to know what people's educational needs are. What did you wish you knew when you first started oxygen? Or if your doctor or your nurse practitioner or your physician assistant is saying, well, you might need oxygen in the next year or so, what do you want to know? What is a good thing for somebody new to the system? What do they need? We need advocacy support. We've got a couple initiatives coming down the pipeline in the next couple of weeks. We need everything. So you can always contact us here on Facebook via the Facebook page, Facebook Messenger, and all that stuff. You can also get us at Oxygen360 at copdfoundation.org. I'm going to see how fast I can type that into the comments here. And I see that I'm actually typing it as my personal thing, but it's still going to be there so everybody can see it.
And while he's doing that, please do, folks, contribute your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, because this program is for you. And we need to know
Absolutely.
what you want and what problems you're having so we know what to address. So Oxygen360 at copdfoundation.org. Write us.
A couple other ways that people can get involved. I mentioned earlier COPD 360 Social, which is our dedicated social network to COPD. Again, this is folks living with the condition. This is caregivers. This is foundation experts. This is outside experts. This is a great place for everybody to come together and share their experience and share their knowledge. You can see we've gotten a lot of oxygen questions on there over the past couple of years. The one that I highlighted earlier today was actually from 2015, I believe. So this social network has been growing for a very long time. We're over 51,000 people today. We're really excited to see it continue to grow. And we're really looking forward to getting folks involved.
Hey, Mike, I don't mean to interrupt you, but Joe Walsh just piped in with a very important comment that I know we as a foundation have taken action on. He says the FDA needs to regulate the misleading advertising of POC companies. He says relating to settings, but our beef with them goes further.
Yes, and that's one of those advocacy efforts I mentioned in the next couple of weeks. Some of you may have seen places like Amazon or eBay. There are places where there are devices that are being marketed kind of sideways as oxygen concentrators that are not oxygen concentrators, that are advertising flow rates that are far exceed any FDA approved concentrator device on the market right now, and that are unsafe, frankly dangerous. And we are going to be appealing to the FDA and to these companies directly. And so stay tuned to COPD Foundation channels, whether it's here on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn or COPD 360 Social. All these places will be sending out some information very soon about how you can help us with this advocacy effort in particular. Debbie asks, how can we get the POC manufacturers to better explain their outputs? It's tough. That's going to be that's part of our ongoing efforts for education. That's part of why we're here today. That's why we wanted to do some of these kind of events and why we want to keep that conversation going. And
But just
speaking of keeping
quickly,
the
if
conversation
somebody
going,
wants to, you just go to their website and you type in specs or specifications, and you can find it. You dig a little, but it's not hidden information. It's just not put on their headline.
yeah, it's not the sexy stuff that moves units, like they might say in advertising or sales, but um, it is available. But again, they're probably also not going to give you the context that you might get through an educational program or something like that, because
True.
they just that's not their deal. They want to sell you a unit in many cases. So and they might be the right unit for you, but it takes a little bit more context. So that's hopefully the things that we're trying to provide. And while we do these events quarterly, as I mentioned, the next one's coming up in November. We do have a monthly program that you can see on the screen right here, and we'll see if we can drop this into the chat also. We have our Oxy Talk virtual coffee hours every month on the third Wednesday of the month at 4 o'clock Eastern. So the next one is coming up actually next week, a week from today, where we can continue these kinds of conversations. We can get some more information about a variety of topics. Doesn't even necessarily have to be just oxygen. You can get questions. You can just hang out for a while. It's a very low pressure, low key approach. It is essentially a coffee hour where we can all kind of share some ideas and insights and all that. We're looking at hopefully lining up some other clinical experts in the coming months that can stop by and give us some more information and maybe do a little mini presentation like we saw today. But in the meantime, come by and get some questions answered. Anybody watching today, one of the things that John has suggested I ask, anybody watching today or anybody who's attended an Oxy Talk in the past, bring 2 people next time. It's kind of like any other meeting or support group or anything like that. We want to build this community because we know that the oxygen using community and COPD community in general has gone way overlooked for way too long. So we want to start changing that and getting our voices together so that we can do a lot more effective advocacy work. So
I think we had a sellout today, so we may need to invite even more or find a way to get even more to attend. But if everybody would just invite 2 more people, oh my God, the places we could go. I sound like Dr. Seuss, but it's true. The places you'll go.
So a couple answers right off the top. This is our question and answer period here. So I'm going to take a couple from the last chats today. We've got a couple people asking if this is going to be recorded. And yes, it is. It's going to be available here on Facebook. And then it will also be available in a slightly cut down version with maybe some of our tech glitches removed at the beginning of the show on our YouTube channels. And we'll be able to, it's shareable in a couple of different routes. So yes, it's being recorded. And yes, it will be available after the fact. Let's see, I'm going to slide back up here a little bit. We got to go all the way back to Linda. Portable went into the shop about 6 weeks ago. Luckily, had the refillable bottles on hand. So because she didn't anticipate the breakdown. So that's a good tip to make sure that you have some backup plans, not only for equipment breakdowns, but even things like power outages. John, before the show, John was mentioning you've got some big storms coming through the area or about to come through the area.
I do what?
You've got some big storms about to come through your area.
Oh yeah, the storms. It's pretty bad. The sirens were going off earlier. I thought if they keep going, I'm going to have to go into the basement and leave. But right now it's okay.
So fortunately, didn't lose power this time, but always good to have a backup plan. The foundation does have a disaster preparedness booklet and some great information in there to help you prepare for these kinds of things, or even equipment breakdowns like Linda experienced. So Let's see, we're going to slide down here. Joe Walsh mentions air blowers. Yeah, these are the kind of things that they're out. They're wellness machines, and they have a lot of different euphemisms for it. And then in weird looking letters so that they're not searchable quite as easily, they'll say oxygen concentrator. So somebody reading it looks and says, oh, that's an oxygen concentrator. But the algorithms and stuff that are supposed to find fake posts and stuff won't be able to take that down. Bob mentions on O2 24/7, have been for 5 years now. Has a home concentrator, portable in tanks, needing to plan for all failure modes. Very exactly right what we're talking about. Have contact lists for emergency O2 if all your contingency planning fails, all that stuff. Absolutely critical. Debbie mentions even the FDA approved ones are confusing. Friend was told settings of 6 was actually 6, like liters per minute. And Mark ties that up with wish they would remove the numbers and put symbols or letters, because then people would have to test the unit out. And I think that's a great idea, because right now the numbers are essentially like volume. I always say that they're like volume numbers on a radio. You know, one company has 2, one company has 20. There's no continuity between most of them. So it does get very confusing. And he also says when even most RTs don't understand the math, not realistic to expect the user to be able to sort it out. So Debbie asks if IPF patients join in, will that be infringing the COPD community since O2 needs are different? I would say absolutely not. This is an initiative where we're trying to help all oxygen users, and we've actually had some pretty close contacts with the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, and we're trying to figure out some ways where we can work together, because oxygen needs are different in many cases. There are a lot more people in the pulmonary fibrosis community who need higher flows than most folks in the COPD community. We do have some people who are on pretty high flows, but particularly with exercise. But we do want to be a service to anybody who uses oxygen. So absolutely, the more the merrier. Come on down. Joe mentions have the Foundation IT folks create a link for OxyTalk on the website. That's a fantastic idea, and we'll make sure we get on that. And we're going to be we've been a growing program for the last few months, and it's time for our website or our web page, our specific web page, to grow along with that. We originally didn't have a lot of content, and now we're getting more and more all the time, and more projects and everything else. So we're proud of that. But we do need to make it a little bit easier to find. So thank you very much. Tony says this may be a question for a different show, but I have heard that as many as 25 people with COPD have never smoked. Is that accurate? So here's another myth that maybe we can bust. John, what would you say if somebody said as many as 25% of people with COPD have never smoked?
I would say that's true.
And I would agree. That's what our statistics say.
The statistics say that between 20 and 25% of COPD patients never smoked. So that means
that is absolutely
about
true.
80% did. But here's the enigma. Only 20% of smokers get COPD. And that's where you get into different reasons why they get them. And we don't know that because I know you're a Star Trek fan, Mike, and that was the last frontier. I think the biome of the lung is the last frontier, and there's simply so much that we do not know that we still have to learn. Seriously.
And we need to have a better idea of why some people smoke and don't develop COPD. We need to understand how people can have occupational exposures and develop COPD, and some don't. We need to understand better why it seems to affect women a little bit worse than men. Unfortunately, COPD has not been a huge research priority compared to other conditions for many years. It's another thing that groups like the Foundation, groups like the Dorney-Koppel Foundation with their COPD SOS campaign, we're all trying to work together to try and change that so that we can have some better answers for a lot of these things. But You're absolutely correct.
It's just to quote the
Really
numbers,
appreciate.
it's the third leading killing disease in the country, and it's 155th in funding. So that's why we need advocates.
Yeah, it is.
Not only for earlier detection and awareness and education, but and for research, but also for telling those that lead our country in Washington that we need funding.
Absolutely. And so John, or Mark, I should say, co-signs the work we did today, mentioning that he and Noah did a webinar a couple years back. I remember that one. Free to view still on their website. They concur with virtually everything we offered today. So hopefully next time we'll be able to up that up to everything and not just virtually. But yet another source for the information to complement all of our efforts. And yes, absolutely. We've got a lot of great advocates out there, a lot of great experts, all, again, pulling together to try to improve everybody's knowledge. So Shar has some information about her device. She says, I must be different. Just like everybody's a little bit different. My portable delivers pulse 1 to 4, and I use it at the 3 setting. I use my home at 2 for sleeping, 3 for moving, and 4 for heavy exercising. After using my pulse, my nose is not runny. If using the home concentrator, I have a runny nose. Too much humidity or not enough? Any ideas? So let me take that one first, and then John, I want to see if you have some thoughts on that as well. What I have experienced is a lot of times when you have like an irritant to your nose. Like I always think of going outside in the wintertime. That air is cold, that air is very dry because it's cold, and it starts irritating your nose. One of your first responses to that, your body's first responses to that, is to start making more mucus in your nose. When you go back into a place that's warm, you're suddenly making too much for that environment. And it takes your body a minute to downshift. And so until your body does that downshift and backs off on some of that mucus production, it's got nowhere to go except out. So I suspect that when you're changing back and forth between the settings in your continuous flow home concentrator, that's inducing, when it's at the higher flows, your nose is making a little bit more mucus. And then when you back off a little bit, then you get that runny nose, just like I was just describing. With the pulse dose, you don't have that constant irritation. And so you probably don't have as much of a change in your mucus production. And that's why you don't have the runny nose. So I don't know if that really answers the question about humidity, because I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot that can be done with humidity, with changing any humidity levels. John, do you think you might have any insight there?
Well, you were talking about like really technical explanations about how mucus develops, and that's beyond me. I do know that if you go into cold air as you inhale it, that immediately, at least to me, I could be wrong, I'm not a clinician, folks, it constricts your airways. So you go out into the cold and all of a sudden you have a narrower passage to get the air in and to get the air out, because remember, you have to get it all out to get it in, or you're going to have air trapping, which we have anyway, but it will become worse. As far as how the in and out and the cold and the hot develops mucus, I've honestly not even thought of. I suppose I could do a song and dance and come up with something, but if I don't know the answer, I'm proud enough to say I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. And I don't know that my explanation is exactly what's going on for Shar or not either, but that would be my best guess. If you were sitting in front of me at the clinic right now, that's what, as a matter of fact, I have told people who have brought the weather situation involved. I haven't had that exact question about the changing back and forth between concentrators and stuff. But that's what I would tell you.
Our good friend Andy joined. I see Andy said hello to us. And Andy's a good friend of ours from Great Britain.
From across the pond. Hi, happy
Just
evening
had
to
to
you.
give a little nod to our friend across the pond.
So Tony mentions having heavy occupational exposure and some smoking. And then Linda, I should have remembered this from her. I should have remembered that she was still watching. Didn't smoke, has the genetic form of COPD called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So again, that's another subgroup of folks who didn't smoke or anything like that, and still end up with this kind of issue. So Mark says, even more technical term, reactive rhinorrhea. Common for many new oxygen users and among those who are inconsistent users. I would suspect not even just, well, I mean, inconsistent users, sure, but probably folks who are going back and forth between different flows as well, because inconsistent, I don't know if there's a better word, but inconsistent is like, people who aren't maybe using it as much as they're supposed to, or, like sometimes when I take my blood pressure medicine, I'm real good about it for about 4 days, and then I forget about it until my Kelly talks about, did you take your medicine today? So that's inconsistent use. But yeah, dry gas at high flows may also cause it, usually self-limiting. So, and we do now have a formal request, John, for a song and dance. Shar would love to see a song and dance from you.
A song and dance?
You just mentioned doing a song and dance instead of admitting that you didn't know. So now you're committed. Now you're on the hook.
I'm not going to do a song and dance. And if Caroline were here, I'd maybe tell a joke, but then maybe not.
All right. Well, I do see that we are about quarter past the hour. We've had some really great interactions today. The questions have slowed down a little bit, so hopefully I got to everybody. If I didn't, I invite again everybody to join us next week for our Oxy Talk, and we can get into a little bit more conversation with that. Or we'll see you around COPD360 Social. We'll see you here on our social media channels. You can always drop us a line at Oxygen360 at copdfoundation.org to let us know how you're doing.
In the coffee chat, you're actually on screen too. Everybody gets to see and talk and chat with everyone.
You don't have to be if you're not comfortable with it. Again, it's low pressure. We love to see everybody's smiling faces. But I know, even though we're a year into this pandemic, I know not everybody likes to be on camera or feels they're on camera too much, and so on and so forth. So it is a little bit more interactive.
I'll do a song and dance.
A little bit more of a conversation. What's that, John?
If you guys show up and request it on the coffee chat, I'll do a song and dance.
Well, there you go, folks. You heard it here first.
But you gotta
really appreciate everybody.
50 people there. So you have your challenge. 2 people. Bring 2 people. If everyone brings 2 people, I'll do a song and dance.
2 tickets to the John Linnell show. All right, everybody. Thanks for spending part of your Wednesday with us live. Part of your day if you're watching this on the recording. Really appreciate you stopping by. Hope you're out there taking care of yourselves and taking care of each other. And we will see you around the internet.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's your show. We're glad you came.